You worthless girl, you should be grateful anyone would take you. Victoria's voice cut the chapel air like a blade. Elena stood in a borrowed dress 2 sizes too large. A pen was shoved toward her as if mercy could be notarized. The man beside her, blind, they said, spoke softly, "It's okay. I understand if you can't do this." Nothing in Elena's last 6 years had been gentle. His voice was the first thing that didn't bruise when it touched her. 6 months earlier, Elena Martinez had been scrubbing the same marble floors she once skated across in socked feet as a child. At 22, she drifted through the estate like a well-trained ghost, visible when needed, blamed when seen. Victoria Ashford's heels ticked across the foyer, tapping a ledger in the shape of a heart. The command was simple: redo the floors, redo yourself, erase the girl who dreamed and leave the servant who obeys. Madison arrived with the weather change that always followed her, cool, sharp, indifferent. "There has to be another way," she said, but her eyes were on the paintings, not Elena. The truth spilled, creditors closing in, $50,000 due in 2 weeks, the house perched on the edge of public shame. Elena's mop paused mid-arc. For the first time, Victoria needed something from her. "What plan?" Elena asked, though her bones already understood. Victoria's smile was frostglass then. "You're getting married, dear. A blind man needs a caretaker wife. He'll pay $50,000. It's more than you'll ever be worth otherwise." The words landed with the dullness of a verdict. "You want to sell me?" Elena whispered. "Don't be dramatic," Victoria replied. "This is purpose. Security. Gratitude." The old script, charity case, burden, mouth to feed, rattled its chain. That night, Elena unboxed what was left of her parents, a photo, a bracelet, a watch, a letter that said she was the brightest star in their sky. She pressed the paper to her chest like a shield that had forgotten how to block arrows. "If I refuse," she'd asked earlier. The answer had been eviction by sundown. Love was not the currency in Victoria's house, signatures were. Morning broke gray, faithfully matching her mood. The meeting place was a modest cafe downtown, neutral ground for a life-altering transaction. Elena wore the navy dress from her graduation, a small rebellion against becoming a receipt. The man at the window table was taller than she'd imagined. Dark hair, touch of silver, posture like a sentence that knew its grammar. He turned toward her voice with clear green eyes that didn't see, but met. "Thomas?" she asked. "Elena," he said, in a voice that made room for answers. He had already ordered coffee for her, plain, safe, kind. He didn't perform helplessness. He didn't apologize for existing. They began with truth because everything else was exhausted. "Are you being pressured?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "By your stepmother?" "Yes." The word felt like opening a window in a sealed room. He listened without hurrying her toward a conclusion. He asked what she would do if money disappeared as a reason to stay small. "Teach," she said. "Like my mother." The dream sounded fragile out loud, like glass that still remembered fire. When her phone buzzed, Victoria reminded her what obedience cost. Thomas heard the weather change in Elena's breath. "I don't love you," she said. "I don't know you. If we do this, it's a business arrangement." He nodded, not offended, not wounded, simply real. "I'm not looking for love either," he said. "Companionship. Respect. Someone who sees the person, not the deficit. A pact formed out of honest shortages." He wanted conversation at dinner and the occasional hand when the world built itself for eyes. She wanted a door out of a basement that had taught her to measure hope in inches. "Dreams deferred aren't destroyed," he said. "Sometimes they're patient." The line lodged in her like a seed waiting for rain. By the time Elena crossed back over her threshold, the decision was set in a quiet place inside her. Victoria greeted her like a cashier counting change. The ceremony would be small, the witnesses efficient, the timing swift. Elena asked for her mother's things and learned that grief had a resale value and books could be called clutter when their margins remembered love. On Saturday, warmth arrived out of season. Elena pinned her hair with her mother's last bright thing and let the car carry her away from the house that had buried a home. The chapel was plain and dignified, the minister kind. Thomas came with his lawyer, James, who smiled like a decent man does when the world tries not to be. Vows were spoken as if reading sensible instructions. Rings made promises their voices didn't yet know how to hold. A chaste kiss, a quiet congratulations, and then, an envelope from Victoria with Elena's papers, the closest thing to a blessing she had ever given. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Home felt like a word that wanted proof. Elena nodded anyway. Part of her knew, whatever waited behind the next door could not be as small as the room she had survived in. It could be worse in other ways, but not smaller. That, at least, was a kind of hope. Cliffhanger, the apartment door opens on a life that doesn't match the story Elena was. James drove them into the historic district, where houses stood like well-kept secrets. The Victorian townhouse was trimmed with care, a small front garden tried its best to be spring all year. "Third floor," Thomas said lightly. "I hope you don't mind stairs." Elena minded only cages. Inside, sunlight laid itself across hardwood floors and brick walls, and the harbor glanced in through tall windows. The furniture was elegant without boasting. There were books, braille, yes, but also printed volumes scaffolded in neat rows. The kitchen looked like it had opinions about sauces. None of this matched small trust fund or desperate invalid. "The guest room is yours," he said, opening onto a blue and white quiet with flowers and a view of the garden. "Change anything you want." Elena stood in the doorway like someone who had been told to enter a painting. "It's perfect," she managed, and felt the word choose her back. They ate chicken marsala at a table by the window. He moved through the kitchen with a practiced ease that belonged to a person who learned by doing and kept the lesson. "How long ago was the accident?" she asked. 3 years, he said, and the silence that followed told her there was more story under the sentence. "I adapted." He said it without bravado, like stating a weather pattern. Days found their rhythm. Mornings smelled like coffee and something new. Elena explored the neighborhood with a map in her head and keys that fit the right doors. In the study, consulting projects multiplied across calls and emails. She heard French sometimes something else. He sidestepped questions with charm instead of walls, which was its own architecture. The small rituals mattered, reading aloud at dinner, the curve of conversation that held both of them, her laughter arriving in places that had been quiet so long they startled at the sound. And yet, she noticed the way his hands found things without searching, the exactness with which he turned toward voices, the way money dressed a room without asking permission. A week in, the city gifted Elena a magazine cover she didn't ask for. At the newsstand, a familiar face stared back with eyes that saw everything. Adrian Blackstone, the billionaire who disappeared. The article said heir, empire, accident, seclusion. The photo said clarity. Elena bought the magazine because the ground had slipped and paper still pretended to hold things steady. At dinner she placed the open spread between the plates like evidence laid before a jury. He looked down for a long heartbeat, then up, seeing, and there it was, the truth snapping the last thread of pretense. "I can explain," he said. "I'm listening," she replied, and for the first time since the chapel, she felt fully awake inside her life. He was Adrian, not Thomas. He was not blind. He was sorry. She was furious. The room traded oxygen for honesty and waited to see who would breathe first. Cliffhanger, Adrian is about to tell her why he disappeared, and why he chose her. Elena had been adjusting to the strangeness of her new life. Morning light fell into a room that didn't leak loneliness. Meals weren't rationed guilt but shared conversation. She began to almost believe the arrangement might be manageable, maybe even safe. And then came the newsstand. The face on the magazine cover was too familiar to be coincidence. The headline screamed what her heart already suspected: Adrian Blackstone, the billionaire who disappeared. The eyes on the glossy page were not blind, they stared with focus and certainty. The jawline, the hair, the presence, it was him. Her husband, but not her husband. Not Thomas Chen, modest blind man. Adrian Blackstone, heir of a vast empire. She bought the magazine with trembling hands, ducked into a cafe, and devoured every line. He had vanished from public life after an accident. Rumors of blindness, seclusion, betrayal by fiancé, his partner James holding the company together. All of it made a broken kind of sense. And yet, how could this be the same man who had sat across from her, admitting weakness, asking only for companionship? That evening, Elena placed the magazine between them on the dinner table. The silence that followed was so sharp it seemed to cut through her chest. He looked at the cover, then at her, with eyes that saw. The lie was exposed. "I can explain," he said softly. Elena's pulse thudded in her ears. "Then explain." Cliffhanger, Adrian prepares to reveal the truth behind his deception. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his hand moving through his dark hair in a gesture that seemed part weariness, part confession. The silence in the room stretched out, thick with tension, before he finally spoke words that shattered the fragile trust between them. "My name is Adrian Blackstone," he said quietly. "I am the heir to Blackstone Industries. And you're right, I'm not blind." The words landed with the weight of a fallen cathedral, crushing the air from Elena's lungs. She stared at him, her chest tightening. "You've been lying to me this entire time?" "Yes," he admitted, his voice steady but lined with regret. "But not without reason." The magazine on the table lay open between them like a witness to his deception. Elena pressed her trembling hands against its glossy surface, as if to keep the truth from leaping out and strangling her. The man on that cover, sharp-eyed, impossibly wealthy, confident, was not the man who had sat across from her in a coffee shop and spoken softly about loneliness, about companionship, about deferred dreams. She felt betrayed, played like some naive pawn in a game she hadn't known existed. "Not without reason," she repeated bitterly. "You lied to me about who you are, about everything. And you think a reason makes it better?" Adrian's jaw clenched. "I need you to understand. After the accident, I really was blind, for 6 months. In those months, I saw clearer than I ever had in my life. People I trusted abandoned me. Friends disappeared. Business partners circled like vultures. And the woman I thought I was going to marry left me within weeks. She said she couldn't be tied to someone who couldn't provide better opportunities." He gave a hollow laugh. "Apparently love has a price tag." Elena's anger faltered for a moment as she heard the rawness in his voice. The image of him, proud and powerful, suddenly abandoned in darkness, stirred something deep in her. But the fury returned quickly. "So your solution was what? To disappear, pretend to be blind forever, and test everyone around you? And then trap me in this experiment of yours?" "No," Adrian said firmly, his green eyes locking onto hers. "That wasn't the plan at all. When Victoria contacted my lawyer, James, she painted a very clear picture, an orphaned young woman, penniless, with a cruel stepmother drowning in debt. She said you would marry me because she demanded it, because you had no other choice. I could hear it in your voice when we met, you were being forced. And I thought, maybe I could help you. Maybe by paying the money, I could give you an escape." Elena's lips parted, confusion warring with anger. "Help me? You mean you knew? You knew I was being sold, and you just went along with it?" "I knew," Adrian admitted. "I never intended to hurt you. The money wasn't about buying a wife, it was about buying you freedom from her. But then," he stopped, his voice faltering. "Then I met you. I saw your strength, your honesty, the way you carried all that pain without bitterness. And I didn't just want to help you escape, I wanted to know you. To spend time with you. To see if something real could exist between us." Elena shook her head, tears burning the corners of her eyes. "Something real? How can there be anything real between us when it all started with lies? You let me believe you were helpless, that you needed me. You manipulated me into pitying you. You turned me into a caretaker for someone who didn't even need it." Adrian flinched as if her words had struck flesh. "I never wanted your pity. I wanted your truth. And you gave it to me. That first day in the cafe, when you admitted you didn't love me, when you told me this was a business arrangement, that honesty meant more to me than you can understand. It was the first time in years someone had spoken to me without trying to flatter or use me. That's why I didn't walk away. Elena rose abruptly, pacing the room, her arms folded tight across her chest. Her voice shook with rage and hurt. Do you have any idea what it feels like to be me? To be told you're worthless, unwanted, a burden, and then forced into marriage with a stranger just to keep a roof over your head? Do you know what it's like to dream of being a teacher, of building a life, only to have every dream stolen and sold for cash? No, Adrian said quietly, standing as well. His eyes followed her every movement, sharp and unflinching. I don't know what that feels like. I've never been poor. I've never been hungry. I've never had to make impossible choices just to survive. But I do know what it's like to be betrayed by the people who swore they loved you. I know what it's like to be abandoned in your weakest moment. And I know what it's like to feel like you'll never be truly seen for who you are. His words hung between them like fragile glass. Elena stopped pacing, her breath heavy. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire on the magazine cover, not the blind man at the cafe, but the person standing in front of her, flawed, lonely, desperate for something real. So what now? She asked finally, her voice rough. Do you expect me to forgive you, just like that? To play house with you in this luxurious apartment and pretend we didn't start our marriage on lies? Adrian shook his head. No. I don't expect that. What I want is for you to make your own choice, freely, without coercion. If you want to leave, I'll make sure you have everything you need. College, housing, financial stability, you'll never have to crawl back to Victoria. You'll never have to scrub floors again. You'll be free. And if you choose to stay, we'll build something honest this time. Together. Elena stared at him, her heart torn. His words sounded sincere, but sincerity had lied to her before. She thought of her father's letter, telling her she was worthy of love and happiness. She thought of the kindness Adrian had shown her over the past week, the respect he'd given her voice, the spark of hope he'd ignited about her dreams. Could that have been real, even if the foundation was false? She swallowed hard. If I stay, I have conditions. Adrian's eyes softened. I'm listening. First, no more lies. Not ever. If you want this marriage to work, it has to be built on truth. Agreed, Adrian said without hesitation. Second, I'm not going to be some ornament in your life, or some charity case you take care of. If I stay, I'm your partner. That means I contribute, I work, I build something with you. I won't just sit here while you make decisions. Of course, he said. That's exactly what I want. Third, we take this slow. We may be married, but we barely know each other. I don't want to pretend we're in love just because vows were spoken. If love happens, it has to happen naturally. Adrian exhaled slowly, relief softening the tension in his shoulders. I understand completely. No pretending. We take it slow. For the first time since discovering the truth, Elena felt the fury in her chest ease slightly. The wound was still raw, but perhaps not fatal. She studied him carefully, searching his face for deception, and saw only weary sincerity. Fine, she said. We'll try it your way. But remember, Adrian, you've already had your chance to deceive me once. You won't get another. He nodded solemnly. I won't waste it. As she turned away, Elena wasn't sure if she had just saved herself from ruin, or stepped into an even greater storm. But at least this time, she had set the terms. And for the first time in years, she felt like she had a choice. Cliffhanger, Elena has agreed to stay, but only on her own conditions. Can Adrian prove he deserves her trust, or will his past lies resurface to destroy them both? The days after Elena's ultimatum passed like cautious steps across thin ice. The atmosphere between her and Adrian was fragile, tentative, but different from before. The lies had been aired, the truths laid bare, and though trust was not yet restored, it had begun to breathe again. For the first time, Elena felt she was not simply surviving in his home, she was learning to live. Each morning started with small rituals that were strangely intimate. Adrian brewed coffee with an efficiency that surprised her. She had expected the clumsiness of someone feigning blindness, but instead, he moved through the kitchen with assured grace. Elena caught herself watching him, torn between anger at his deception and fascination with the quiet confidence he carried. When he slid a steaming mug toward her, he said nothing about the unease in her expression. He simply sat across from her, waiting for her to speak if she wished. That patience was its own kind of gift. But it wasn't just the mornings. Adrian began to draw her into his world deliberately. One afternoon, he invited her into his study, a warm space lined with bookshelves, maps, and files stacked with meticulous order. "I want you to see what I really do," he told her. Not the cover stories, not the magazines, but the work itself. At first, Elena hesitated. What did she know about business empires, about the decisions of billionaires? But then Adrian handed her a stack of scholarship applications his foundation had received. "Read them," he said simply. "Tell me what you think." She read. And the words on those pages broke her heart. Stories of students with dreams bigger than their bank accounts, of children working after school to support families, of bright minds dimmed by poverty's shadow. Elena recognized herself in them, the longing for education, the hunger to prove worth, the frustration of doors closed before she could even knock. "These are incredible kids," she said softly, her fingers trembling slightly as she set the applications down. "But many of them don't just need tuition. They need mentors. People who believe in them, guide them. Otherwise, they'll drop out, even with financial help." Adrian's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "Go on." Elena leaned forward, her voice gaining strength as her ideas spilled out. "We could build a mentorship program. Pair scholarship recipients with professionals in their fields. Create internship opportunities, support systems. Not just money, but community. That's what would make the difference." For a long moment, Adrian simply stared at her, something like awe flickering across his features. Then he smiled, real, unguarded, warm. "You've just solved the problem my board has been circling for months. Elena, that's brilliant." Heat rose to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. For once, she didn't feel like an imposter in his world. She felt capable, valuable. As if her voice mattered. That night, they stayed up late at the dining table, drafting outlines, making lists of potential mentors and fields of study. Adrian listened more than he spoke, allowing her to lead the vision. Elena realized that in this space, she wasn't his charity case, she was his partner. The more they worked together, the more the distance between them closed. Their conversations wandered beyond philanthropy, into childhood memories and future dreams. Adrian confessed that sometimes he envied people who grew up with simpler lives, untouched by wealth's suffocating expectations. Elena admitted she still dreamed of teaching, even if she wasn't sure how to balance it with the strange, new life she was living. "You could still be a teacher," Adrian told her one evening, as they reviewed scholarship letters. "You have the heart for it. You see potential where others see problems. That's rare." Elena looked at him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. She had spent years being told she was useless, worthless, a burden. Now here was a man who saw her not as baggage but as someone capable of shaping futures. The validation settled deep inside her, mending wounds she hadn't realized were still bleeding. Of course, not everything was easy. There were nights she still recoiled from his presence, reminded of the lies that had birthed their marriage. Sometimes, in the quiet after dinner, she wondered if she had made a mistake staying. But then Adrian would ask her opinion on a decision, or thank her for her insight, or simply listen without judgment as she shared pieces of herself she hadn't spoken aloud in years, and the doubts softened. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Elena found herself walking home from the university library where she had been researching teaching programs. As she passed a newsstand, her heart seized for a moment, half expecting to see his face splashed across another cover. But the magazines this time bore politicians and celebrities, not Adrian. She exhaled with relief, realizing how much fear she still carried that the past might explode into her present again. When she arrived home, she found Adrian in the living room, reviewing documents. "How's your day?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes attentive. "I signed up for 2 college classes," she admitted, a little nervous. "Introductory courses. Just to start." Adrian's face lit up with pride. "That's wonderful, Elena. I'll support you every step of the way. This is exactly what we talked about, building your future, not just surviving mine." She smiled despite herself. The distance between them had lessened so much since that night of revelation, but in moments like this, she realized how far they still had to go. And yet, for the first time in years, she wanted to go forward, not back. But peace, it seemed, was never meant to last. One rainy evening, as she set a kettle to boil, the sound of urgent knocking echoed through the apartment. She opened the door, and froze. Standing there was Victoria, drenched, desperate, her eyes wild with fear and greed. "Elena," she gasped, stepping past her uninvited. "Thank God. I need your help." Elena's heart plummeted. The woman who had destroyed her childhood, who had forced her into marriage like a commodity, was here in her sanctuary. The shadows of the past had followed her into the light. Cliffhanger, Victoria has returned, bringing with her the debts, desperation, and poison Elena thought she had left behind. Victoria stood in the doorway like a storm that had finally found the house it wanted to ruin. Rain slicked her hair to her temples, mascara pooled beneath her eyes and bruised half-moons. The scent of wet wool and stale perfume followed her inside. She took in the high ceilings, the careful art, the soft light, and something jealous and feral flickered across her face. "Elena," she said, already moving past the threshold, already reaching for the furniture as if ownership were a habit you could not break. "Thank God you're here. They're going to take everything." Adrian appeared from the hall with the quiet authority of a man who had learned not to raise his voice to be heard. He didn't look surprised, he looked prepared. "Ms. Ashford." Victoria's gaze darted between them, recalibrating. "You can see," she blurted, suspicion and calculation racing each other. "Of course you can. I knew something was off. The apartment, the way you move. Why are you here?" Elena asked, her voice steady in a way it had never been under this roof before. She set the kettle back on the stove, turned off the flame, and faced the woman who had taught her to be small. Victoria clasped her hands, wedding ring tan line pale against her skin. "I need help. The creditors, it's worse than I said. They're threatening legal action, repossession. They'll seize the house." "Madison," her voice cracked neatly on her daughter's name. "We have nowhere to go." Elena felt the old instinct rise, the reflex to soothe, to patch, to hand over the last warm thing she owned just to stop the yelling. But the reflex had no place here. This was not the kitchen where she'd learned to disappear. This was her home now. Her life. She let the instinct pass through her and kept breathing. "How much?" Adrian asked, not unkindly. Victoria named a number that made the room seem smaller. It wasn't 50,000. It was ruin scaled in zeros. "Short-term bridge," she said quickly, like a gambler describing a guaranteed win. "Just until I soar a buyer for the lake property. There's interest, real interest. You'd be repaid within months." "You mean the property you already mortgaged twice," Adrian said, the facts landing without malice. "The one tied up in 3 separate liens." Victoria flinched. "Who told you that?" "You did," he replied gently, "in the documents you signed." She pivoted to Elena, eyes glassy with desperate tenderness Elena had seen performed for strangers at charity lunches. "Sweetheart, please. I took you in when your father died. I kept a roof over your head. I protected you." "You sold my mother's books," Elena said. The sentence left her mouth calmly, like a thing that had waited years at the door. "You called them clutter. You took her ring to the pawn shop and told me it didn't suit my hands. You didn't protect me. You hid me." For a heartbeat, Victoria's expression broke. Then, as always, she chose anger over shame. So that's it? You marry well and suddenly you're cruel? You'd watch your family drown? You taught me we weren't a family, Elena answered. We were a balance sheet. Victoria's gaze slid to Adrian, hunting leverage. You think keeping her from me will make her love you? When this falls apart, and it will, she'll realize who she belongs to. Adrian didn't move. Elena belongs to herself. It should have been a small line. It felt like a cathedral door opening. Victoria tried the next weapon, threat. I can go to the papers. Billionaire tricks orphan into marriage under false pretenses. How would your board like that? How would your shareholders? Try it, Adrian said, not unkindly, not bravely, just certain. We'll answer with the truth. And if you harass Elena again, we'll seek a restraining order. I don't want that. I'd rather you find help you can actually use. He nodded toward the table, where a neat packet of papers lay as if it had been waiting for this exact hour. Debt counselors. A reputable attorney who specializes in restructures. An intake appointment for a gambling recovery program, tomorrow at 10. If you want a lifeline, take one you can hold. For a moment, Victoria's face crumpled into something human. Fear, fatigue, the dawning knowledge that no one was coming to save her the old way. She reached for the packet as if it might bite. You'd do this? I won't fund your debts, Adrian said. But I will fund your recovery if you commit to it. Quietly. No press. No performance. Silence folded itself around them. Outside, the rain softened to a patient mist. Elena watched the woman who had named her worthless weigh humiliation against survival. Victoria's fingers tightened around the folder, then loosened. I'll think about it, she said, which meant no. If you change your mind. We won't, Elena said, gentle and unyielding. Victoria's mouth trembled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You always were ungrateful. She turned, paused, and delivered a final, sulking sermon to the room. This won't last. Men like him don't stay. When the shine wears off, you'll remember who kept you fed. I already remember, Elena said. And I remember who kept me hungry. The door closed behind Victoria with a click that sounded, to Elena, like a key turning in a lock from the inside. She stood very still. The kettle, forgotten, ticked as it cooled. Somewhere down on the street a bus sighed and moved on. Adrian didn't touch her. He simply stood within reach, as if proximity could be a promise. How do you feel? Elena searched for a word that was not a metaphor, not a speech, just the shape of what lived in her chest now that the hurricane had passed. Light, she said at last. Like I set something down I didn't know I was carrying. They made tea and drank it in the living room without talking, the way people do after a funeral when the grief is clean and the future is undecided. Later, Elena gathered the packet from the table and slid it into a drawer by the door. Just in case tomorrow was a braver day than today, for someone. When the lamps were off and the apartment had returned to its usual hush, Elena stood by the window and watched the rain bead the glass. She wasn't thinking of revenge or vindication. She was thinking of space, how much room a person needed to grow, how small a life could become when every decision bent towards someone else's appetite. Behind her, Adrian said softly, "You were extraordinary." "No," she answered, and surprised herself by smiling. "I was practiced." He accepted the correction. "Will you let me walk with you while you unlearn it?" Elena turned from the window. The city lights made constellations on the floor. "Yes," she said, "not as surrender but as treaty. If we walk slow." Life after Victoria's visit unfolded with a gentleness Elena had never known. The constant weight of her stepmother's control had been lifted, and in its place there was space to breathe, to dream, to live. The apartment no longer felt like a stranger's domain. Slowly, it began to feel like hers too. Mornings carried a new rhythm. Adrian rose early, moving quietly through the kitchen while Elena studied at the small table by the window. The sound of pages turning, the smell of fresh coffee, the clatter of dishes, it was ordinary, but to Elena it felt miraculous. No one barked orders. No one hovered with criticism. She was simply allowed to exist, and in that existence, she began to blossom. Adrian, true to his word, treated her as a partner. He invited her to meetings, not as an observer but as someone whose opinion mattered. When she suggested creating mentorship circles within his scholarship program, he listened, adjusted, and implemented her ideas. At one meeting, a board member chuckled dismissively at her suggestion, only for Adrian to cut him off with quiet authority. "She's right. We'll move forward with it." Elena had never been defended so effortlessly, so naturally, and the validation brought heat to her cheeks and strength to her spine. Their partnership extended beyond philanthropy. Evenings were filled with shared dinners, sometimes elaborate meals Adrian cooked with surprising skill, other times simple takeout when both were tired. They spoke of everything: books, music, the strange quirks of human behavior. Adrian confessed that he sometimes missed anonymity, the ability to walk into a cafe without being recognized. Elena confessed she still dreamed of teaching third grade, just as her mother had. These conversations built a bridge between them, plank by plank, until they could stand in the same space without fear of falling. One late evening, Elena sat curled on the couch, textbooks open on her lap, when she caught Adrian watching her. His expression was unguarded, tender in a way that made her chest ache. "What?" she asked, embarrassed by the attention. He shook his head, smiling faintly. "I'm just proud of you. You're doing exactly what you said you wanted to do, reclaiming your dreams. Do you know how rare that is?" Elena swallowed hard, her throat tight. "No one's ever been proud of me before." Adrian's eyes softened. "Then they were fools. Because you were remarkable." The words lingered with her long into the night, a warmth she carried like a secret flame. But it wasn't all perfect. There were moments when Elena's old wounds reopened, times when Adrian's sudden absences for business calls made her suspicious, times when the enormity of his wealth and influence overwhelmed her. She had grown up invisible, voiceless, and now she was married to a man who moved entire markets with his signature. Sometimes she wondered if she could ever truly belong in his world. Adrian seemed to sense these doubts. One evening, he took her hand as they walked along the harbor, the city lights glittering against the dark water. "You keep worrying about whether you belong," he said. "But Elena, you are my world. I've built empires, yes, but what's an empire without someone to share it with? You give all of this meaning." Elena stopped, staring at him, tears stinging her eyes. For years she had been told she was nothing. And here he was, telling her she was everything. That night, back at the apartment, Elena closed her textbook, heart pounding. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken feelings, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Adrian looked stunned for a moment, as if he had been holding his breath for weeks waiting for those words. Then his expression softened into something so raw, so real, it nearly undid her. "Elena," he said, his voice husky, "I've loved you since the cafe. Since you told me the truth when you had nothing to gain. I just didn't think I deserved to say it." They sat in silence for a long time, the confession filling the space around them like a new atmosphere. It wasn't fireworks or fairy tales. It was steadier, deeper, the kind of love born from honesty and scars, from respect and resilience. In that moment, Elena realized something profound: love wasn't about perfect beginnings. It wasn't about dresses or vows or wealth. It was about two people choosing, day after day, to see each other clearly and to stay. And as she leaned into Adrian's embrace, she knew that for the first time in her life, she had chosen well. Elena often thought of her life in chapters. The chapter of childhood, warmth, her mother's laughter, her father's steady arms. The chapter of loss, her father's sudden death, her stepmother's arrival. The chapter of servitude, years spent on her knees scrubbing marble floors while Victoria measured her worth in chores and silence. And then the chapter of deception, marrying a man she thought blind, only to discover the truth hidden behind his green eyes. But now, she was living in a chapter she had never imagined for herself. The chapter of choice. Weeks after their confessions of love, Elena awoke each morning with something she hadn't felt in years: anticipation. College courses filled her afternoons. Foundation work with Adrian filled her evenings. Their lives began weaving together in threads that no longer felt forced but chosen. The arrangement that had once been born of debt and desperation had transformed into something genuine, something worth protecting. Adrian kept his promise: there were no more lies. When business crises arose, he told her. When shareholders grew restless or rumors swirled in the press, he didn't hide them behind polite silence. Instead, he sat with her at the kitchen table, sharing the burden, listening to her perspective. And sometimes, her ideas disarmed him completely. "You make me see angles I never would have considered," he admitted one night, after she'd suggested a partnership with a nonprofit to expand their mentorship program. "You make me better." For Elena, the transformation was subtler but just as profound. She no longer felt invisible. Her voice mattered. Her opinions carried weight. And perhaps most importantly, she had begun to believe her father's words again, that she was worthy of love, of happiness, of all the beautiful things this world had to offer. The wounds of the past had not vanished, but with Adrian, she found the courage to let them heal. Still, doubts sometimes lingered like ghosts. One evening, while they prepared dinner together, Elena found herself staring at the simple gold band on her finger. "Do you ever regret how this began?" she asked softly. Adrian set down the knife he was using to chop herbs, his expression serious. "Every day," he said. "Not because I married you, but because I deceived you. I hate that our story started with lies. But I'll spend the rest of my life proving that the man you see now, the man who loves you, that's who I truly am." Elena reached across the counter, resting her hand over his. "And I'll spend mine reminding you that I'm not fragile. That I'm not someone you rescued, but someone who chose to stand beside you." The honesty of that exchange became the cornerstone of their marriage. They were not a fairy tale couple, free of flaws and misunderstandings. They argued. They stumbled. They misread each other. But every time, they returned to the terms Elena had laid down: honesty, partnership, patience. And slowly, those terms blossomed into something greater: love without pretense, respect without condition. Months later, Elena stood at a podium in a modest auditorium, addressing the first group of scholarship recipients chosen under their new program. She looked out at dozens of young faces filled with hope and fear, and for a moment, she saw her younger self among them, the girl with dreams too big for the walls that confined her. "You are not your circumstances," she told them, her voice steady. "You are your choices, your resilience, your courage to keep going. And there are people, like us, who believe in you." Adrian sat in the front row, his eyes never leaving her, pride shining in every line of his face. After the ceremony, he whispered as they walked hand in hand through the crowd, "You were magnificent. You were what I always knew you were meant to be." Elena smiled, tears threatening but not falling. "For the first time, I feel like myself again. Not a burden, not a commodity, not a pawn. Just me." Adrian kissed her hand gently. "And that's who I fell in love with." The story of Elena and Adrian wasn't one of perfection. It was a story of broken beginnings mended by truth. A story of a young woman who refused to stay buried beneath someone else's greed, and of a man who learned that love could not be bought, only earned. Together, they built a life where masks were unnecessary, where each flaw was not hidden but honored. Victoria never returned. The past lingered only as a reminder of what Elena had overcome. And as seasons turned, the scars of her servitude faded into lessons, shaping her into the woman she had always been destined to become. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the harbor and the apartment filled with the golden hush of twilight, Elena leaned against Adrian on the couch. "Do you know what I realized?" she whispered. "What's that?" he asked, brushing his thumb over her hand. "That this isn't an arrangement anymore," she said. "This is a marriage." Adrian pulled her close, his voice breaking with emotion. The only one I'll ever want. And as Elena rested her head against his shoulder, she knew her father had been right. She was worthy of love, of happiness, of all the beautiful things this world had to offer. It had taken lies, betrayal, and a forced wedding to bring her here, but here she was, and here she would stay. Final note: Elena's journey proves that love does not demand perfect beginnings. It demands courage, honesty, and the willingness to see one another clearly. In choosing truth over pretense, she and Adrian had rewritten not only their marriage but their entire lives. And in that rewriting, they found something far more valuable than wealth: they found each other.